So far, we have talked about the costs of mitigation. But we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions for a reason. So mitigation of greenhouse gases obviously has a value. In the end, by reducing emissions, we avoid dangerous impacts. At Delft University of Technology, we attach a value of €150 to each ton of avoided CO2 emissions. Why do we do that? It is exactly because we think that avoiding CO2 has a value, and we want that to be reflected in the decisions that we make. In this video, we first talk about evaluation and then how this valuation can play a role in organizations and in society. If you operate a company, you pay for the goods and services that you use. But you may also use resources or produce impacts for which you do not pay. An obvious example is the emissions of pollutants that may lead to damage and associated cost to other people. We call these impacts externalities, and the related costs that you are causing external costs. The emission of CO2 and other greenhouse gases is one such externality. So if you emit CO2, you generate an external cost. But how can you attach a value to this external cost? Basically, there are two approaches. One is that you calculate the cost of damage. If you emit CO2, what impact will it have? It will ultimately lead to reduced harvests, or it can cause damage through extreme weather events. People's health may decline, or ecosystems may deteriorate. By counting all these cost elements together, in theory, you know the cost of damage by CO2. The other approach is that you say, okay, we need to reduce emissions, for example, to the level of maximum 1.5 degrees C compared to pre-industrial levels. And then you'll calculate, with the help of scenario analysis, what costs need to be made to sufficiently reduce emissions. It will turn out that all measures need to be taken below a certain cost level. We call that the marginal abatement cost level. This is then what we can use as the value of avoided CO2 emissions. Although both approaches look different, economic theory tells us that they should lead to the same valuation of avoided CO2 or greenhouse gases. Let us first have a look at option number one, the cost of damage. Many economists have tried to calculate these costs, and the findings of literature overview show that the outcomes can vary largely. The cost can range from close to zero, there may also be benefits, but they can also go up all the way to over $2,000 per ton of CO2. The average of all studies come to $55 per ton of CO2. It should be noted that these estimates can be incomplete. For example, recently a lot of attention is paid to heat stress, but it's likely not yet included in this damage costs. Impact on biodiversity is often not quantified. And most of all, it's important that outcomes depend very much on the discount rate that you apply. Impacts in the long run play a relatively small role if you use a discount rate of, for example, 5%. Thus, the concept of damage cost is valuable, but it doesn't help us to get a precise estimate of the damage caused by CO2 emissions. So, let's have a look at the other approach, marginal abatement costs. Let's first have a look at a recent study by the International Energy Agency, in which they depict the transition to an energy system with net zero emissions by 2050. The latter is also the name of the report. In this transition, in 2030 the marginal cost would already be $130 per ton of CO2. And in 2040 that would even go beyond $200 per ton of CO2. Of course, there are more studies, and in this graph the IPCC has aggregated many of them. Without going in detail, this confirms that there is a large variation. But the baseline is, in ambitious mitigation scenarios, marginal abatement costs are typically well above $100 per ton of CO2, maybe even quite a bit more. Having said that, how do we make use of this concept? Many companies decided to attach a value to avoided CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. Already 226 of the 500 largest companies in the world are doing that. For example, if they make an investment decision, they attach a value to avoiding greenhouse gas emissions, steering the investments in a climate-friendly direction. As I mentioned in the beginning, Delft University of Technology has attached a value of €150 to every ton of avoided CO2 emissions. It is a much higher value than $28 per ton as set on average by these companies, but is also much lower than $460, which is the registered maximum. Not only companies internalize costs, but also governments. One form is a carbon tax. A carbon tax is simple. You pay a fixed fee for each ton of CO2 that you emit. A completely different approach is a cap and trade system. In a cap and trade system, there is a cap on the total allowed emissions. This creates scarcity, and hence these allowances get a value, as the allowances can be traded freely among companies. This way, the market determines the price of CO2. So that's another way to internalize the cost of CO2 by governments. There are quite some countries that already have implemented the price on carbon. You see that in this map. Often the prices are quite modest, e.g. $10 per ton of CO2. But companies in the European Union already face a price above $60 per ton of CO2. The same for citizens in France. Some countries like Sweden have already higher taxes, above $100 per ton. Coverage of emissions by carbon prices is expanding and prices are increasing. So, to summarize, avoiding CO2 has a value, but it is difficult to determine this value precisely. Nevertheless, it's worthwhile to internalize these external costs of CO2 emissions. And many companies and countries are already doing that.